The woman who would change Silas's world arrived not on a sun-drenched afternoon, but in the teeth of a late autumn storm that turned the sky to bruised pewter and the streets of Redemption Gap to a churning river of mud. She stood on the boardwalk in front of the bank, a solitary figure wrapped in a dark, sodden cloak, her belongings contained in a single, water-stained valise at her feet. The wind tore at her, whipping strands of dark hair from the severe bun at her nape and plastering her thin dress to her frame. She did not flinch. Her stillness was a rock in the current of the town's frantic rush to get indoors. Her name was Anya, though no one in town knew it yet. She had come to Redemption Gap following a promise, a letter from a man who had sworn to make her his wife and provide a home. That man now lay buried in an unmarked grave 200 miles east, a victim of a fever that had swept through their wagon train with the indifference of a prairie fire. She was left with his last possession of any value, a legal document, a deed to a small parcel of land he swore was his, signed over to her in a final, rasping act of contrition. Now she was a widow before she had ever been a bride, and the document in her hand felt as flimsy as the hope that had carried her west. Her posture was one of exquisite control, her back ramrod straight, her chin held at an angle that suggested a dignity her circumstances belied. But her eyes, the one feature left unprotected from the elements, betrayed her. They were a pale, cloudy grey, and they did not track the scurrying figures of the townsfolk. They stared fixedly at the sign for the bank, but it was a vacant stare, as if she were reading not the letters, but the space between them. She was, for all practical purposes, blind. She could perceive light and shadow, the vague shapes of things close by, but the world beyond arm's length was a watercolour left out in the rain. The inciting crisis arrived in the form of Mr. Thornton, the town's banker and leading merchant. He was a man whose respectability was as carefully curated as the merchandise in his general store, a thick veneer of civility over a core of cold, calculating greed. He emerged from the bank, pulling on his gloves, and stopped, his path blocked. He looked at the woman, his gaze a quick, dismissive appraisal of her worn clothes and solitary state. "You are in the way, madam," he said, his voice a model of strained politeness. Anya flinched at the sound, turning her head slightly. She held out the folded, damp paper. "I am looking for Mr. Thornton," she said, her own voice quiet but clear, with a precision in its diction that was jarringly out of place in the muddy street. "I was told he could help me with this. It is a deed for land. My husband, Mr. Hayes, he purchased it." Thornton's face, already pinched by the cold, tightened further. He took the paper with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents with a speed that spoke of long practice in assessing value and finding flaws. A small, cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Hayes," he said, the title dripping with scorn, "this paper is worthless. The note on this land was called in 2 months ago for non-payment. The land reverted to the bank, to me." He folded the paper and, instead of returning it, he let it fall from his fingers. The wind immediately caught it, tumbling it into the muck of the street where it was instantly ruined. "Your husband was a debtor and a fool. I suggest you move on. There is nothing for you here." He made to step around her. The sheer public cruelty of the act was a pronouncement. It declared her destitute, her claim invalid, her presence an inconvenience. It was a social execution. The few townspeople who had paused to watch now looked away, their discomfort a tangible thing. Her isolation was complete. From across the street, inside the shadowed doorway of the general store, the male protagonist watched the scene unfold. Silas was a man who had made a fortress of his solitude. Since his wife, Eleanor, had been taken by the winter flu 3 years prior, he had retreated into his ranch and into himself. His land was vast, his fences were high, and his heart was a locked room. He came to town only when necessary, a tall, quiet figure whose presence commanded a grudging respect, born of his competence and his utter lack of pretense. The townsfolk whispered that he was haunted, that he would die alone amidst his cattle and his grief. They were probably right. He had no interest in the town's petty dramas. He had seen Thornton fleece newcomers before. Usually he felt a distant, grim satisfaction in seeing the man's true nature confirmed. But this was different. It was the woman's stillness that caught him. The way she did not crumple, the way her spine remained straight even after the banker's final, crushing blow. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she clutched her valise, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. It was a quiet resilience that reminded him achingly of his Eleanor. Grief, he knew, was a kind of weather, and this woman was standing in the heart of a hurricane without letting it break her. Silas was not a man given to impulse. His actions were deliberate, weighed and measured like feed for his livestock. But as Thornton moved to brush past the woman, leaving her stranded on the boardwalk, something in Silas shifted. It was the quiet sense of justice that ran in him like an underground river, a current that had been dammed up by sorrow but had not run dry. He pushed off from the door frame, his worn boots making no sound on the wooden planks, and crossed the muddy street. He did not approach her directly. He stepped between her and Thornton, a solid, unmovable presence. Thornton, startled, took a step back. The banker's practiced civility faltered in the face of Silas's cold, assessing gaze. "She needs a place to get out of the storm, Thornton," Silas said. His voice was low and gravelly from disuse, but it carried a weight that cut through the wind. It was not a request. Thornton puffed himself up, his authority challenged. "That is not my concern. The boarding house is—" "Full," Silas cut in, his eyes never leaving the banker's. "And you know it. The men for the new rail spur took every room." He knew this because he had tried to book a room himself to wait out the storm and had been turned away. He then turned his head slightly, addressing the woman for the first time. His gaze softened, just a fraction. He noticed then the cloudy uncertainty in her eyes and understood. Her stillness was not just pride, it was a necessity. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from iron to something gentler. "My name is Silas. I have a ranch a few miles out of town. It is large. The house is empty, save for me." He paused, letting the implications of his words settle. He could feel the eyes of the town on his back. He was offering shelter to a stranger, a woman, and in a town like Redemption Gap, such an act was tantamount to a public declaration. He was not offering charity, however. His pride, and his assessment of hers, would not allow it. "I am in need of a bookkeeper," he stated, the words coming out as a plain declaration of fact. "My ledgers are a mess, and the house, my wife was particular about it. It has not been particular since she passed." He looked directly at her, willing her to understand the transactional nature of his offer. "I can offer you room and board, and a fair wage for your work. In return, you would bring order to my books and my home. It is a business arrangement." Anya, who had been braced for the final humiliation of being left to freeze, felt a tremor of disbelief. This man's voice was different. It was not pitying, nor was it predatory. It was practical. It was a lifeline offered not as a gift, but as a rope to be grasped and climbed. It preserved the one thing she had left, her dignity. She could not see his face clearly, only a tall, broad shape against the grey blur of the town, but she could hear the honesty in his voice, as solid and real as the cold rain soaking through her cloak. "I am a very thorough bookkeeper," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "And I am a tidy housekeeper." Silas gave a single, decisive nod. It was settled. He bent down, his large, calloused hand easily lifting her valise. "Then the arrangement is agreeable." He turned, his back to Thornton and the gawking town, and began walking toward his wagon, assuming she would follow the sound of his footsteps. For the first time in 3 years, Silas was not going home alone, and in the silent, seething face of the banker left standing on the boardwalk, a new and dangerous conflict had just been born. The journey to the ranch was made in a silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the drumming of rain on the canvas cover. Anya sat beside Silas on the wagon bench, a small, still figure huddled in her damp cloak. She did not speak, and he did not press her. He understood that some shocks were too deep for words. He simply drove, his hands sure on the reins, his presence a quiet, solid anchor in the storm. The house, when they arrived, was exactly as he had described it, large, sturdy, and empty. It was a good house, built of solid timber by his own hands, but grief had settled into it like a fine layer of dust. The air inside was stale, cold, and smelled of wood smoke long dead. In the main room, a fine layer of dust covered the heavy oak furniture. The curtains, once Eleanor's pride, were drawn tight, and the rocking chair by the hearth sat perfectly still, as if no one had dared disturb it in years. It was a house holding its breath. Silas set her valise down by the door. "The kitchen is through there," he said, pointing. "There is food in the pantry, the well water is clean. Upstairs, the room at the end of the hall is yours. It was a guest room." He hesitated. "It has a good mattress." The practical details were a comfort, a way to build a bridge across the chasm of awkwardness between them. Anya, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of someone navigating by memory and sound, ran a gloved finger along the back of a chair. It came away grey. She did not comment on it. She simply unpinned her cloak, her movements economical and precise. "Thank you, Mr. Silas," she said formally. "I will need soap, water, and rags, and then I will prepare a meal." Her work began the next morning. Silas awoke to a scent he had not smelled in his house for 3 years: coffee. He came downstairs to find a fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth pushing back the chill. Anya was in the kitchen, a clean apron tied around her waist. A pot of oatmeal was simmering on the stove, and a plate of biscuits, impossibly light, sat on the table. The room was not just clean, it was alive. This became the pattern of their days. Anya moved through the house like a quiet tide, reclaiming it from the grip of neglect. She did not rearrange or discard, she restored. She washed the curtains and hung them back up, letting the pale autumn light filter into the dusty rooms. She polished the furniture until the wood gleamed with a deep, warm luster. She learned the layout of the house with her hands and feet, her memory creating a perfect map where her eyes could not. She never once bumped into a piece of furniture. Her competence was a quiet, relentless force. Silas watched her, at first with a distant, detached curiosity, and then with a growing, unspoken admiration. He would come in from the fields, tired and grim, and find the house warm, a hot meal waiting, and a sense of peace settling back into the spaces where sorrow had lived. He had hired a housekeeper, but he was slowly realizing he had brought home something more akin to a master artisan, a specialist in the restoration of broken things. Section M's section. Her true genius, however, was revealed when she turned her attention to the ledgers. Silas's bookkeeping was, as he had admitted, a disaster. It was a shoebox filled with receipts, scribbled notes, and statements from Thornton's bank, all jumbled together. For 3 years he had operated on a kind of grim autopilot, selling his cattle, paying his bills, and not looking too closely at the numbers. It was too painful a reminder of the future he and Eleanor had planned, a future that had been balanced on the columns of these very books. Anya sat at the large dining table which she had cleared and polished until it shone. She laid out the papers, her delicate fingers sorting and stacking them with an uncanny speed. She could not read the fine print, but she could see the shapes of the numbers, the columns, the dates. She had brought with her a small, powerful magnifying glass, a relic from her former life, and with it held close to her eye she could decipher the text, line by painful line. For days she worked. The only sounds from the dining room were the rustle of paper and the soft scratch of her pen as she created a new set of books, her handwriting a model of elegant clarity. Silas found himself making excuses to be in the house just to watch the quiet intensity of her focus. He had never seen anyone work with such methodical precision. One evening, as he sat by the fire cleaning a piece of harness, she finally spoke. "Mr. Silas," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "may I ask you a question about your arrangement with Mr. Thornton's bank?" He looked up. "Ask." "Your initial loan for the northern pasture expansion," she began, tapping a page in her new ledger. "The terms state an interest rate of 5%. That was 5 years ago. However, for the past 3 years, since the month after your wife passed, the interest applied to your account has been calculated at 7%. Furthermore, there are monthly service fees here that are not listed in your original agreement. The overcharges, compounded over 36 months, are significant. She stated it as a simple fact, but the implication hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Silas put down the harness. He walked over to the table and stared down at the neat columns of figures. He saw the dates she had circled. He remembered that time as a blur of grief and paperwork, of signing things Thornton put in front of him without reading them, desperate to just be done with it, to get back to the isolating solace of his ranch. He had been vulnerable, and Thornton had taken advantage. The realization was a slow, cold burn of anger in his gut. He looked at Anya, at the way the lamplight caught the dedicated line of her jaw. She had seen what he had refused to see. She had brought not just order to his house, but clarity to his life. In that moment, the last vestiges of his pity for her vanished, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. She was not a victim he was sheltering. She was an ally who had just handed him a shield and sharpened his sword. "Thank you, Anya," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The formality of their arrangement had just cracked, and through that crack something new and fragile was beginning to grow. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty, but full of a shared understanding, a quiet partnership forged in the face of a common enemy. Word of Silas's new housekeeper spread through Redemption Gap like a contagion. The arrangement was a source of endless speculation and gossip, fanned into flame by the subtle, poisonous whispers of Mr. Thornton. He would mention it to the ranchers who came into his bank, a look of feigned concern on his face. "A shame about Silas," he would sigh. "To be so lonely, he takes in a woman of unknown character, a blind one, at that. One has to worry about his judgment." Thornton's malice was not born of simple gossip. It was strategic. Anya's presence at the ranch was a threat he had not anticipated. He had counted on Silas's grief-stricken apathy to continue indefinitely, allowing him to slowly bleed the ranch dry through fraudulent fees and manipulated interest. The thought of a competent bookkeeper, especially one with a reason to despise him, poring over those ledgers was enough to cause a knot of anxiety in his otherwise comfortable life. He needed her gone. The pressure began subtly. A shipment of fencing wire that Silas had ordered and paid for through the general store was lost in transit. The new ranch hand he tried to hire was mysteriously offered a better-paying job at the rail spur, moments after agreeing to work for Silas. The blacksmith suddenly found he was too busy to shoe Silas's horses. These were inconveniences, petty acts of sabotage designed to isolate him, to make his life more difficult, to remind him of the cost of defying the town's established order. Silas bore it with a stoic calm, but inside a cold anger simmered. He was a man who valued his independence above all else, and he could feel Thornton's net tightening around him. He found himself growing more protective of Anya, seeing the town's suspicion as a direct assault on her character. Their conversations remained sparse and practical, but a new current ran beneath them. When he spoke of the lost wire, her jaw would tighten. When she reported that the price of flour at Thornton's store had inexplicably risen by 10%, his hands would clench into fists. They were allies now, bound by a shared sense of injustice. The threat escalated one crisp October afternoon. Silas returned from town to find a letter slipped under his door. It was from the bank. Thornton, citing a clause in the fine print of the loan documents, the very documents Silas had signed in his fog of grief, was calling in the note on the northern pasture. The clause stipulated that the loan could be made due in full if the property was deemed to be improperly managed, or if the owner's moral standing came into question. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly damning. It gave Silas 30 days to produce a sum of money he did not have, or the land, the best grazing land he owned, would be forfeit. He stood in the kitchen, the letter trembling in his hand, the words blurring before his eyes. It was a direct attack, not just on his livelihood, but on his honor. The accusation of improper management was a lie, but the insinuation about his moral standing was a clear and vicious reference to Anya's presence in his home. Thornton was using her to ruin him. Anya heard him enter. She had come to recognize the sound of his boots, the very weight of his tread. This time it was different. It was heavy, defeated. "Mr. Silas?" she asked from her seat at the dining table, where she was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and perfect. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the hearth and stared into the flames. The ranch felt less like a fortress now and more like a prison. He had brought this trouble upon her. His attempt at a simple act of decency had put them both in the crosshairs. "Thornton has called the note on the north pasture," he said, his voice flat. "He's using you as the excuse." He expected her to be frightened, to be angry, perhaps even to offer to leave. Instead, she put down the shirt and stood up, her face a mask of calm determination. She walked toward the sound of his voice until she was standing just a few feet away. "He is not using me, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet strength that startled him. "He is threatening us, and we will not let him win." In her simple, defiant plural, us, the entire dynamic of their relationship shifted. They were no longer an employer and an employee, a protector and a victim. They were partners, and the battle for the ranch had just truly begun. The dry autumn air, once a blessing for the harvest, became a source of constant anxiety. The grasses in the pastures were cured to a brittle golden tinder, and the wind that swept down from the high country had a sharp, predatory edge. Every night Silas would walk the perimeter of his property, a rifle in his hand and a knot of dread in his stomach. He knew Thornton was not a man to give up easily. The legal threat had been the first volley. The next would be more direct. The crisis came on a moonless night, the sky a black velvet cloth pricked with the cold, distant light of stars. A sudden, warm wind kicked up, a chinook that carried the scent of pine, and something else, something acrid and sharp. Silas was in the barn, checking on a mare due to foal, when he heard it, a low, hungry roar that was not the wind. Anya was the first to know something was truly wrong. Her senses, sharpened by the absence of clear sight, were attuned to the subtleties of the ranch's nightly symphony. She smelled the smoke moments before it became a visible haze, a bitter chemical tang that was nothing like hearth smoke. It smelled of kerosene. At the same time, she felt a change in the air pressure, a deep percussive thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of the house. It was the sound of panic, the drumming of hundreds of hooves. Silas burst from the barn, his face grim in the sudden hellish orange light that was blooming on the horizon. The eastern pasture, the one bordering the road, was on fire. The flames, fanned by the Chinook wind, were moving with terrifying speed, a wall of destruction rolling directly toward the main barn and the panicked herd of cattle now stampeding in their paddock. It was not a random act. The fire had been set deliberately, a perfect, calculated strike at the heart of his livelihood. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. His mind raced, cataloguing the threats. The herd, if they broke through the paddock fence in their terror, would scatter across the valley or be driven into the fire. The barn, full of hay and equipment, and the pregnant mare, was a tinderbox. He had to choose. He could not save both. It was then that Anya appeared, a ghostly figure in her white nightgown, her face illuminated by the flickering demonic light. She was not screaming or crying. Her face was set in a mask of intense concentration. "The herd," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "The gate to the north pasture. If we can turn them, the creek will stop the fire on that side." It was a desperate, almost impossible plan. The gate was on the far side of the paddock, and the cattle were a churning, terrified mass of horns and hooves, but it was the only plan they had. "Stay here," Silas yelled, grabbing a wet sack from the water trough. "It's too dangerous." But Anya did not listen. She had already tied a scarf over her nose and mouth and was moving, not toward the house, but along the fence line of the paddock, her hand trailing along the familiar wood. She knew this fence. She had walked it with Silas just a week before, checking for weak spots. Her mind held a perfect three-dimensional map of the ranch. While he fought the fire with brute force, she would use her unique, precise knowledge to save the herd. Silas, seeing her moving with such purpose, felt a surge of something more powerful than fear. trust. He left the fire to her implied command and ran for the paddock, his focus narrowed to the single, desperate task of turning the stampede. He was a force of nature, shouting and waving the sack, trying to impose his will on 1,000 pounds of pure animal panic. Anya reached the far corner of the paddock. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of singed hair. The cattle were a terrifying, shapeless wall of noise and motion just feet from her. She could feel the ground trembling beneath her. She reached the gate, her hands finding the familiar wooden latch. It was heavy, built to withstand the pressure of the herd. She put her shoulder into it, her small frame straining with the effort. For a moment, it wouldn't budge. Then, with a final, desperate heave, the latch lifted and the gate swung open into the darkness of the north pasture. For a heart-stopping moment, the cattle ignored the opening, continuing to press against the far fence, their eyes rolling with terror. Then the lead cow, an old, wise matriarch, saw the gap. She veered, and like a river changing its course, the entire herd followed, pouring through the gate and into the safety of the open pasture beyond. Anya pressed herself flat against the fence as the tide of living bodies thundered past, the wind of their passage tearing at her nightgown. When the last cow was through, an eerie quiet fell over the paddock, broken only by the crackle of the approaching fire. Soot-stained and trembling, Anya sagged against the fence, her heroic act complete. She had not used strength or sight, but a clear-headed courage and an intimate knowledge of her surroundings. She had saved the heart of the ranch. In the exhausted, ash-strewn aftermath, as the first hints of dawn grayed the eastern sky, the full extent of the damage became clear. The fire, having consumed the eastern pasture, had been stopped by the creek bed on one side and by Silas's desperate, back-breaking work with wet sacks on the other. The barn was saved, the herd was safe, but the pasture, his best early-season grazing, was a blackened, smoking ruin. Silas found Anya sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a thick wool blanket he had thrown over her earlier. She was shivering, not from the cold, but from the lingering shock. He sat down beside her, the space between them smaller than it had ever been. For a long time they just sat in silence, watching the smoke curl up from the charred land, the shared trauma a palpable thing in the air. He looked at his hands, calloused and blackened with soot. He had built this ranch with these hands, had defended it, but tonight it would have been lost without her. He turned to look at her profile, her face pale and smudged in the growing light. "I haven't thanked you," he said, his voice rough. "You saved them. You saved everything." She shook her head, a small, tired gesture. "We saved them." He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently took her hand. Her fingers were icy cold in his warm, rough grasp. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than polite, professional distance. This was different. This was a man holding the hand of a woman who had stood with him in the heart of a fire. "When Eleanor died," he began, the words tasting like rust in his mouth, "I thought the world had ended. I boarded up the windows of this house and the windows of my soul, I suppose. I didn't want to let anyone in. I didn't want to feel anything again." He paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "Tonight, watching that fire, the only thing I was afraid of was losing you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Anya's fingers tightened around his. She turned her face toward him, her cloudy eyes searching for the shape of him in the dim light. "When my husband died on the trail," she confessed in turn, her voice barely a whisper, "I was not afraid of being a widow. I was afraid of being useless, of being a burden. Mr. Thornton, he saw me as a piece of paper to be thrown in the mud. Tonight I was not useless." In that shared moment of vulnerability, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He was no longer just a grieving recluse, and she was no longer just a resilient outsider. They were two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their former lives and had forged a bond in the crucible of a shared crisis. He held her hand tighter, a silent promise that she would never be a burden, and she held his, a silent assurance that he would never be truly alone again. The sun crested the horizon, casting a golden light over the ruined pasture, but on the porch of the ranch house, something new and whole was beginning to be born. Armed with a new and unshakable resolve, Silas and Anya prepared for their counterattack. The fire had been an act of war, but it had also been a mistake. It had stripped away any lingering doubts Silas had and forged his and Anya's quiet arrangement into a formidable alliance. Anya, in the days following the fire, returned to the ledgers, but this time she was not just an accountant, she was a forensic investigator. She worked with a quiet, burning intensity, cross-referencing dates, invoices, and bank statements, the magnifying glass her only weapon. The key came from an unexpected place, a small, leather-bound diary she had found at the bottom of the shoebox of receipts. It had belonged to Eleanor. Most of it was filled with notes on her garden, recipes, and sketches of quilting patterns. But in the back, for a period of about 6 months, Eleanor had meticulously tracked the household expenses, noting the prices she paid for flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples at Thornton's general store. Anya compared Eleanor's notes from 4 years ago to the current prices Silas was paying and to the prices listed on invoices for other ranchers she had found in the shoebox. A clear and damning pattern emerged. Thornton was running 2 sets of prices, a fair one for the established, powerful ranchers and an inflated one for those he perceived as weak or vulnerable, like the recently widowed Silas. The service fees on Silas's loan were just the tip of the iceberg. Thornton was systematically extorting him through the store as well, a slow, methodical theft that amounted to hundreds of dollars. The ledger she had created was no longer just a record of overcharged interest, it was an indictment. The day of the confrontation was clear and cold. Silas hitched the wagon, his movements calm and deliberate. Anya sat beside him on the bench, the new ledger wrapped in oilcloth and resting on her lap. She wore her best dress, a simple dark wool, and her hair was pinned up with a severe elegance. They were not going to town as supplicants, but as accusers. They timed their arrival for midday Saturday, when the town would be at its busiest. Ranchers and their families filled the main street, and the area in front of Thornton's general store and bank was a hub of activity. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop directly in front of the bank, his placement of the vehicle a deliberate challenge. He helped Anya down, and for the first time, he did not release her arm. They walked together toward the entrance, a united front. Thornton was standing behind the main counter of his store, smiling obsequiously at the wife of a wealthy landowner. He saw Silas and Anya enter, and his smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He excused himself and moved toward them, his expression hardening into one of polite inquiry. "Silas, is there something I can help you with? I am quite busy." "I believe there is," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent store. The other customers, sensing a confrontation, had stopped their chatter. "We have come to settle my account." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Your account is in arrears. The matter of the northern pasture is fraud," Silas cut in, his voice as sharp and cold as a winter morning. Anya, at his side, unwrapped the ledger and placed it on the counter with a solid thud. "And this is the proof." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a calm, steady tone, he began to lay out the facts, turning the pages of the ledger as Anya's finger pointed to the relevant columns. He spoke of the illegal interest rate, the phantom service fees, the dual pricing scheme at the store. He named the dates. He named the figures. He presented the evidence with the unassailable logic of a legal argument. The store grew deathly quiet. Other ranchers, men who had also felt the slow squeeze of Thornton's business practices, began to edge closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion to a dawning, angry comprehension. Thornton's face went from ruddy to pale. He sputtered, trying to bluster his way out. "This is preposterous. The ramblings of a grieving man and his charity case. These numbers are meaningless." "Are they?" Anya's voice, clear and precise, cut through his denial. She opened Eleanor's diary to a marked page. On this date, your store charged my late predecessor, Eleanor, $2 for a bag of flour. On the same date, you charged her grieving husband, Mr. Silas, $3 for the same bag. Is that preposterous, Mr. Thornton, or is it simply theft? The accusation, coming from her, backed by the sainted memory of Eleanor, was a devastating blow. The landowner's wife, who had been Thornton's favoured customer moments before, let out a scandalised gasp. Another rancher, a gruff man named Peterson, stepped forward. "I've been wondering why my books never balanced," he growled, his eyes fixed on Thornton. "Let me see that ledger." The dam of Thornton's authority broke. The crowd surged forward, a murmur of angry voices filling the store. They saw in Silas's ledger a reflection of their own struggles, their own nagging suspicions. Thornton, stripped of his veneer of respectability, was revealed for what he was, a common thief. He backed away from the counter, his face a mask of fear, his cowardly nature exposed for all to see. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, had crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. With the external threat neutralized, a new, more profound quiet settled over the ranch. The wind still blew, the cattle still grazed, but the oppressive weight of Thornton's menace was gone. The town, in a sudden reversal, now viewed Silas and Anya with a mixture of awe and respect. Thornton's bank was facing an investigation, and his social standing was ruined. One evening, a week after the confrontation, Silas and Anya sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a comfort to be shared. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but the house behind them was warm and secure. Silas cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He turned to her, his face earnest and serious in the fading light. "Anya," he began, his voice low, "this arrangement we have, it has been beneficial. You have brought order to my life in more ways than I can count." She tilted her head, a small questioning smile on her lips. "The arrangement has been beneficial for me as well, Silas. You gave me a home when I had none." "It's more than that," he said, struggling for the right words. He was a man of actions, not speeches. "What I mean to say is, I do not want this arrangement to end, but I no longer want a housekeeper or a bookkeeper." He took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want a partner, in all things, for all the years we have left." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object. It was not a diamond, but a smooth, grey stone he had found by the creek, worn into the shape of a heart by the patient water. He placed it in her open palm. "Anya," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am asking you to stay, not as my employee, but as my wife." The proposal was not flowery or grand. It was plain-spoken, practical, and utterly sincere, a reflection of the man himself. It was built not on a fleeting passion, but on a foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a deep, quiet love that had grown between them like a sturdy oak. Anya's fingers closed around the stone, its smoothness a comfort against her skin. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of joy. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes." A year passed. The seasons turned, bringing with them a gentle, healing rhythm to the land and to the two people who called it home. The blackened east pasture was now covered in a carpet of new, green grass. A new barn, larger and sturdier than the old one, stood as a testament to a prosperous year, its fresh-cut pine scenting the air. The ranch was thriving. The town's opinion, once a source of bitter gossip, had transformed into a quiet, deep-seated respect. Silas was no longer seen as the haunted recluse, but as a wise and steady leader. Anya, once the suspicious outsider, was now simply Mistress Silas, a woman whose quiet competence and sharp mind were spoken of in admiring tones. Women from neighbouring ranches would stop by for her advice on gardening, and ranchers, when making deals, would often say, "I'll agree to that, but only if Mistress Silas has looked over the numbers." Her blindness, once a mark of her vulnerability, was now hardly remarked upon. It was simply a part of a woman who was so much more than the sum of her senses. The house was no longer a mausoleum of grief, but a home, filled with the scent of baking bread, the warmth of a constant fire, and the low murmur of comfortable conversation. Anya's garden flourished, its orderly rows of vegetables and herbs a stark and beautiful contrast to the wild landscape beyond. The rocking chair by the hearth was no longer still. It was often occupied by Silas in the evenings, as he read to her from the newspaper or simply watched her hands as she knitted, the firelight glinting off her wedding band. The story concluded, as it had begun, on the porch. It was a warm summer evening, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of crickets. Silas sat in his customary chair, and Anya sat beside him, a basket of mending in her lap. They were watching a new foal, the offspring of the mare that had been saved from the fire, gambol in the paddock. It was a scene of profound and earned peace. "Do you remember," Silas said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble, "the day you arrived? The storm?" Anya smiled, her head tilted, as if listening to a distant memory. "I remember a great deal of mud," she said, her tone light, "and a man who offered a job to a stranger when all she had was a worthless piece of paper." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "It was not a worthless piece of paper," he said quietly. "It was a map. It led you here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her mending forgotten. The last rays of the setting sun bathed the ranch in a soft golden light, the same light that now filled the once empty rooms of their house and their hearts. They had faced down injustice, fire, and the ghosts of their pasts, and had emerged not unscathed, but whole, together. On their land, under the vast frontier sky, they had built more than a prosperous ranch. They had built a sanctuary. They had built a life. And in the quiet contentment of that shared future, they had found their redemption.